Just a quick thing, I am Director of Strategic Projects here at Centre for London. For those of you that don't know Centre for London, we are London's dedicated think tank. We hold events, conferences, live stream public webinars like this. We also produce research, all with the aim of looking at London's biggest challenges. And we generally advocate for a fairer, more sustainable and more prosperous global city. So we're in, a very momentous week this week. COP26 is everywhere. Hopefully you'll be getting me on camera in a second. It feels like this is a particularly good week for launching some work in a very under-considered but crucial aspect of our transport system in London and how we decarbonise it, freight and deliveries. We've been working on this research for quite a long time now. We've involved international experts. It's taken us into a deep dive into Old Kent Road. Apologies, by the way, to the pun averse, but we've called it worth the wait, not just because it's been a longer bit of work than usual. We did think about calling it Order, channeling the not quite ghost of John Burke out, which I quite liked. And one wag even thought about calling it Freight Night, given that our launch was almost on Halloween. That's one maybe for the kids of the 1980s. I just want to say, work like this, we can't do without generous support from partners and sponsors. So I need to thank Prologis, Grid Smarter Cities, the London Borough of Southwark, and also Impact on Urban Health. Without their support, we would have got nowhere on this very important topic. Just a few quick points on how we're going to run things. I mean, firstly, I need to start with the usual caveat that we're doing this on Zoom and, the internet's brilliant, but it does occasionally fail us. If my feed goes down, there is a backup chair elsewhere in London, my colleague Nico, who will step in to chair. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But also let's be tolerant of other things that may happen, Zoom mishaps that we're very familiar with now from any of our participants. We're going to start with some opening remarks from one of our partners, and then my colleague Nikita is going to present the headlines from our research. That will take about 10 minutes. And then we've got a brilliant expert panel who are going to bring really diverse angles to this topic to help us dig into it further. And you'll get a chance to fire in questions. We're going to wrap things up by 12:30 prompt. It's important to know, you may have got this as you joined, that this event is being recorded. Please be aware of that. Do use the chat function. You're probably well used to this by now, to share any reactions, comments. It's actually really helpful for us if you do that. But if you can, include your name and organisation, so we know kind of, who the voice is in that little sidebar. There's also a separate function for submitting questions. Please use that, the Q&A. You can get those in nice and early. Start as soon as Nikita kicks off her presentation if you'd like. You can then vote up and down questions you'd like to see asked at the end, and I'll do my best to make sure our panel addresses them as best we can. If you're having any trouble with Zoom, we're also live streaming on YouTube. You can view this directly from our website, centerforlondon.org. Now, that's enough for me to start with. I'm going to ask the Chief Executive of Grid Smarter Cities, Neil Herron, who's been one of our major sponsors of this project, just to kick us off with some opening words. Neil, are you with us?
Morning, Rob, and good morning, everyone. And it's great to see freight working its way up the agenda. And I think there's a famous commercial a few years ago that says, good things come to those who wait. So it's timely. It's also timely with COP26 and world leaders gathering, talking about the need to act, and not the need to act in 5 or 10 or 15 years. It's the need to act now. And it's also timely in the fact that we're coming out of COVID, and the restriction we've seen during COVID is a massive growth in online deliveries, an increase in pedestrianisation, increase in the growth of cycle lanes, and all of that has led to a diminution, a reduction of the amount of curb space that's available for such deliveries. And freight is often seen as the poor relation when it comes to policy in cities, but really it is at the core and the functioning of any city. And we need to look at the report highlights some of the interventions and recommendations, but really if we want to drive towards a cafe culture, we need to be able to deliver the coffee and the croissants. If we want pubs and restaurants to survive and thrive, we need to be able to facilitate and enable more efficient curbside deliveries. And it's great to see one of the key recommendations is what we've been working on for a number of years, which is the ability to create, or the recommendation for Transport for London and London boroughs to adopt dynamic curbside management, and the ability for freight operators to book the curbside and more efficiently manage, local authorities to manage that more efficiently, is going to be key. It's going to be key to reducing the emissions. It's going to be key to reducing congestion and improving air quality. So it's great to be part of this, and the fact that this report is going to be the watershed, I do believe, in how we'll look at policy for freight servicing and delivery in cities. So I look forward to the presentations and the discussion that's to come.
Neil, thank you very much. That was a brilliant way to start us off. I know that there was a bit of issues with the audio there. Apologies to people if you're not, you weren't able to hear Neil or myself perfectly just there. I'm going to ask Nikita now to join us, if Nikita's with us. And Nikita is going to give us a 10-minute kind of skinny of the research that we've been carrying out into freight and deliveries. Nikita, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. I'll just share my screen now. I hope everyone can see this, but if not, please shout.
Yeah, Nikita, I should say sorry that you are one of the principal researchers on this piece of work. So all the good work is yours. That's way too much of a generous introduction, Rob, especially because this research has been really incredible in being a chorus of different perspectives and different voices who are all passionate about bringing change in this sector. So for that reason, I'm really excited to be delivering this presentation on how to make London's freight and delivery smarter and greener. Though unfortunately and regrettably, I don't have as good puns as Rob shared earlier. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the fact that London relies on the movement of different goods and services, all of which keep the economy functioning. So that there's a diversity of movements, but our report identified 5 sectors that make up the bulk of freight vehicle movements. All of these have certain needs and particular requirements, some of which do overlap, and they also experience certain shifts and trends. I want to point out parcel delivery because I think that's more visible and relatable in terms of our everyday lives, especially because in the last 2 years, especially, we've seen an explosion in deliveries as online shopping, which is already a growing trend before the pandemic, became accelerated due to COVID restrictions that prevented us from shopping in person. This is also closely linked to changes we're seeing in food supply chains, especially as we're seeing the growth in short notice, small scale grocery services, that promise to deliver groceries in less than an hour, sometimes 10 minutes. There's also movements of construction materials and waste, as well as municipal and household waste. And I really want to point out also servicing as another important freight journey movement. Something that was really interesting to observe while delving into the literature was the fact that there's a growing awareness that the increase in vans is also linked to servicing activities, whether that's building maintenance people, plumbers and cleaners, and all those servicing our homes and London's businesses. Now, while all these different movements and goods and services sustain the city, they also come at a severe cost, producing a set of interlinked challenges for the city. So London is the most congested city in the UK, and this of course slows down journeys, increases delivery times, and raises costs for businesses. There's also the fact that 25% of carbon emissions from road transport are from freight vehicles. So in order for London to meet its net zero carbon goal by 2030, decarbonising freight vehicles must be an important aspect of this agenda. Additionally, 34% of nitrogen oxides and 27% of fine particulate matter emissions from road transport come from freight vehicles. And these pollutants are particularly harmful to the health of all Londoners and can also have fatal effects. Something that came out pretty strongly and also repeatedly throughout the research process
was that the tragic death of Ella Adokisi Deborah, the 9-year-old whose death was the first time in the UK that air pollution had been listed as a cause of death, really brought into the public consciousness the fatal effects of air pollution and its particular effect on marginalized communities who are more likely to be exposed to air pollution. There's also the issue of road safety that freight vehicles, especially heavy goods vehicles, pose to Londoners. Now, these issues and these costs look set to stay and even continue rising, especially given the increased cases of journeys being travelled by vans. Now, 90% of freight lifted is moved on London's roads, with the remaining 10% by London's railways and rivers. In the last 2 decades, we've seen a massive increase in the vehicle miles driven by vans in particular. So before the pandemic, this graph shows that between 2009 and 2019, the number of vehicle miles driven by light good vehicles, vans, increased by 62%. Additionally, the sale of diesel vans are at an all-time high, and registrations increased by 82% in March of this year, compared to last year. Now, like any urban, dense and large city, London faces some difficulties in getting deliveries into the city. However, London has a certain uniqueness that exacerbates these challenges. For example, London's narrow streets and tight street patterns and increasing road access restrictions lead to intense competition for road space. Additionally, London has a population density 10 times more than the Northwest. And also Rockington land prices and limited industrial spaces means that warehouses are increasingly being pushed out, and it's difficult to set up consolidation centres in the city. And I just want to plug really quickly another project that we're working on at Centre for London, our Industrial Land Commission, which touches on some of these issues. Additionally, London faces issues around parking and timing constraints, which can act as a double-edged sword, with on one hand, parking restrictions stopping illegal parking, but then also contributing to a lack of available space. And with the London Lorry Control Scheme, reducing the environmental and noise impacts for residents, but also acting as a barrier to certain types of deliveries. Then London also has to confront the issue of a fragmented local government. And so with 32 local authorities in the City of London Corporation, all setting their own agenda around roads and waste management, it becomes a lot more difficult to allow for coordinated action. Still, however, London is exploring certain solutions and is also demonstrating its strengths in certain areas. Like some of its challenges, some of this is related to London's particular environment. So for example, high density means deliveries can be closer to one another, and micromobility vehicles are able to take advantage of London's narrow streets. There's also the potential to shift more by river and rail, and we have some pretty astounding figures that show that freight trains, for example, can remove up to 76 heavy good vehicles off the roads, and water freight is estimated to shift around 265,000 heavy goods vehicles yearly. There's also actions being taken being driven by policy and businesses themselves. For example, couriers like DPD and DHL are increasingly electrifying their fleet, and London has 6,000 charging points, which supports the transition to electric vehicles. But a lot more needs to be done, and London still has a long way to go. I wanted to highlight this quote by a community activist that we spoke with, because I think it summarizes pretty brilliantly the conundrum London faces, which is how to ensure that London continues to meet the demands of its population and ensure that all this happens sustainably. Like this activist mentioned, people do still want things quickly, and London still relies on the movement of goods. But there's also the challenge of where the infrastructure will go. And I think this quote really highlights the importance of bringing people along, working alongside communities, hearing their concerns and seeing them as part of the solution. So as part of this project, we had the opportunity to zoom out a little bit and take a look into what other cities are doing around the world to combat global challenges in meeting increasing freight demand. We did this through case studies, and we also did this with an international roundtable, which brought together leaders from cities and city and transport authorities, freight and delivery companies, and environmental experts who share London's challenges. from cities that share London's challenges, sorry. We also had the opportunity to delve into the challenges and opportunities facing the Old Kent Road area, which in a way acts as a microcosm of the issues that's facing London currently. One of the case studies we looked at was nighttime deliveries in Stockholm, which temporarily removed a ban that operated between 10 p.m. and 6 p.m. to reduce noise pollution, and ended up having several benefits, such as allowing deliveries to be made more quickly and reducing emissions of certain pollutants. However, with this case study, we saw that it wasn't widely spread out or rolled out. We also looked at the Guy's and St. Thomas's Consolidation Centre, which was a really brilliant example of how consolidation and offsite facility can work in practice. So up until the development and creation of the centre in Dartford, the hospital had received about 160 deliveries daily. However, this offsite facility allowed goods to be sorted and organised and delivered in fuller, more efficient load to the hospital, which led to a reduction of 90% in incoming traffic, the equivalent of 36,000 deliveries per year, but also meant that more space can be made available in the hospital itself for clinical use. As I mentioned, we were also able to delve more deeply into the Old Kent Road area, and we chose to look into it because it's one of the worst areas in London for exposure to air pollution. It's a dense residential area, and it has some of the worst health outcomes in the city. For this aspect of the research, we were able to conduct online and in-person surveys of businesses, and we were also really grateful to have an analysis of heavy good vehicle movements and data modelling of local air pollution impacts provided by a team at the Environmental Defence Fund Europe. We were able to observe certain challenges when looking at Old Kent Road. Primarily, Old Kent Road has a higher than average concentrations of air pollution, and exposure to pollution is also high, as people not only live around Old Kent Road, but they also work there and shop there. We also saw that there's different kinds of heavy good vehicles traffic. Some of it is locally generated, but about 28% of vehicles are just passing through the Old Kent Road High Street, but are nevertheless contributing to high levels of pollution. We saw, when talking to businesses, we saw that few are using electric vehicles, and this is because costs sometimes acts as a barrier to more take-up, but also because there's a lack of control of the vehicles that suppliers and couriers are using themselves. Despite these challenges, we also saw some opportunities. For example, one of possibly retirement deliveries, the fact that businesses actually saw sustainable practices as in their best interest, but just the fact that they'll need support, and actually the creation of a business improvement district group could facilitate greater coordination and provide those supports needed. Based on all the research we were able to produce, we came up with certain recommendations, which first of all acknowledge that London has a long way to go, but there is a huge amount of potential that can be unlocked, and that ensuring both the efficient and sustainable movement of goods and services is a complex challenge. And our recommendations make clear that changes will have to be made across the whole ecosystem. And so we've come up with a 4-pronged and coordinated approach to better deliveries. I don't have time to go through them all, so I really do encourage you all to delve deeply into our report. So we have 4 sets of recommendations, the first of which revolves around how to prioritize deliveries. One of the recommendations within this set of recommendations is for the Mayor of London to press ahead with road user charging. And I'm really pleased that we're bringing back a recommendation that Centre for London has been championing for a while now, and that feels particularly relevant and urgent right now. So this would mean that charges would be based on vehicle class and emissions, distance travel, the availability of replacement electric vehicles, where journey takes place, and whether it is deemed essential. Moving on to our next batch of recommendations, this involves delivering to and from the right places, which would mean developing a network of pick-up and drop-off points and making space for logistics hubs closer to residents. Our third set of recommendations revolve around delivering in the right way. This means helping to accelerate the shift to electric vehicles with national government funding upgrades to power distribution networks, and ensuring that London has enough charging points, and investing in the redevelopment of London piers. And lastly, consolidating deliveries with these set of recommendations require making promoting local authorities having more power to require consolidation in designated areas, such as high streets. I had to run these really quickly because of time, but I just wanted to make clear that while these are only a few, they will demand swift changes. And what's been really exciting about this project is to witness the enthusiasm for change from a diversity of actors and stakeholders, as well as decision makers. Thank you for listening.
Nikita, thank you very much. That was brilliant. And thank you for all your hard work on this research project. I'm going to bring in our panel now. So if you wouldn't mind switching on your cameras and your mics. So first up, we've got, I'm just going to quickly intro all of them and then I'll turn to each of them. So we have Kate Langford, who's Programme Director at Impact on Urban Health. We're very grateful to them for partnering with us, helping fund this project. We also have with us Natasha Patel, who is a director at Baringa. Hello, Natasha. We also have Sarah Scannell, and she's Assistant Director of Planning and Development at Hounslow, London Borough thereof. And we are due, although I don't know he's with us yet, to also have Robin Woodbridge, who's the UK Head of Capital Deployment and Leasing at Prologis, who are our principal sponsor for this project and about whom I hope we'll be able to hear a bit more as time progresses. But despite Robin's absence, I'm going to push on and maybe turn to you, Kate, first. If you could just give us a couple of minutes of, what's your role? Why is your organisation interested in this subject? And what's your kind of take, especially thinking about the health impacts, some of which Nikita has already touched on?
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me this morning, Rob and Nikita, and for all of the hard work you put into this report. So I'm Kate Langford. As Rob said, I work at an organisation called Impact on Urban Health. I lead a programme looking at the health effects of air pollution. Everything that we do at Impact on Urban Health is about testing real life solutions to tackle health inequalities in South London. So probably of all the panelists, I'm the odd one out. I'm not from a freight or planning or transport background. I'm from a public health background. So it might be helpful for me to say a couple of words about why, from a public health background, both me and my organisation are really interested in freight and the work that's been done to date. So as I said, I lead a programme looking at the health effects of air pollution. I think Nikita set out really well how freight contributes to air pollution. And I think there's such an opportunity at the moment as we are rethinking how we get our goods and services around our cities to think about how can we better design those systems so that they create a healthier environment for everyone. And by that, I mean reducing air pollution, which contributes to over 4,000 deaths every year in London, but also has more everyday effects, exacerbating asthma, COPD, and impacts on everyone who lives in the city, but particularly marginalised groups. So there's a real opportunity to change the way that our deliveries are done to impact on air pollution, which is a major risk factor for our health. I think it's also rethinking how we do our deliveries can also impact on other determinants of health. So how can we make our roads safer? How can we make them a safer environment for active travel, for walking, for cycling? And I think the conversation about freight plays a really big part on that. It's not just about how we as residents get around London, it's also about how we get our goods and services around London. And I guess the last thing that I'll mention on kind of why we're interested in this on a health perspective is I thought the Old Kent Road case study that Nikita shared was fascinating. Old Kent Road really demonstrates how this is an issue of not just health, but health equity. So we have seen actually a previous research that Centre for London did with Environmental Defence Fund last year, that nitrogen dioxide is 57% higher on main roads. Particulate matter, which is one of the most harmful types of pollution for health, was 35% higher on main roads. if we don't look at deliveries and freight, we're going to miss a big part and a big opportunity to reduce the impact that air pollution has, particularly on communities living in and around main roads like Old Kent Road. And we know that those communities are impacted by a whole range of other risk factors for their health, whether it's unemployment, poverty. So this is something really practical that I think we can do together, and something that we can work together with industry on as well.
Thank you, Kate. That's really helpful to hear. I'm going to go straight to Natasha Patel now. Thanks, Natasha, for being with us. Tell us a bit about your practice, your role at Baringa, and what your sort of take, your angle is on the subject we're talking about, freight and delivery.
Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here, and thank you so much to Centre of London, Rob and Nikita, for having me here. I'm Natasha Patel, and I lead e-mobility for Baringa. So I'm essentially a consultant that's helping commercial fleets, commercial vehicle operators to electrify their fleets and think about how they can move towards more innovative business models when it comes to the use of either their spaces, their locations, their forecourts, as well as their overall sort of delivery plans. So I work in the sector a fair bit. I've been really impressed with the report and the recommendations that have come through it. And I really think that this challenge is a big one. And the reason why it's a really big one, in my perspective, is because it really requires technology companies, logistics companies, retailers, consumers, and the government to come together to address it. I don't think there's one single sort of part of the ecosystem that can truly solve this problem. It's as much of a consumer's problem as it is a government's problem, as much as it is the companies and private sector's problem. And so I think that's really what emphasizes the challenge that we have to face into. And the way I think about it is we've got volume and mode. We've got to reduce the kind of volume that we have in freight deliveries. And there's two ways of doing that. There's obviously consumers that can impact their behavior and their requirement for sort of instant deliveries and an understanding that actually there is a cost to that convenience, a carbon cost to that convenience. And then there's the consolidation itself of the way that we give those deliveries to city centres and reducing the volume with which we can still offer those deliveries and offer that services, but in a more consolidated way. So there's a volume question, and then there's a mode question, and this is especially where I come in, which is that mode should absolutely be electric or low emission or ultra low emission as much as possible. And I think progress in that direction is good. There are some great ambitions that obviously we have from the Mayor of London, but fundamentally progress is slow. Or just over 2% of the van sales in 2020 were electric, and that's after growth year on year. And we've just got quite a lot to go before we're truly in a position where the mode of that transport is as ultra low emission, and we've reduced the amount of that delivery and freight that has to be done in the first place.
Natasha, thank you. That was very insightful. I particularly like your sort of trifecta of, consumers, industry, government. We've all got to do something. We all need to pay attention to this issue. And that's a helpful sort of segue maybe to going to Sarah from Hounslow. Sarah, I'll give you the floor. If you could maybe just tell us a bit about your perspective on this issue, given boroughs, governance is such a key factor, but maybe not the only factor.
Yeah, absolutely. I just echo what the other two panelists have said. I think the importance of this report is the very clear and kind of functional outputs and things that it puts forward that we can do and call to action. From a local authority perspective, I think there's some really, really important points and interesting things that we can take forward. So, for example, from my perspective in London Borough of Hounslow, post-pandemic, post-Brexit has led us to look right now at how we do a lot of things, particularly things like how our neighbourhoods are set up, how our town centres work, and the way that the council can influence what happens in those spaces. So we are currently commissioning a kind of a corporate asset review. What is it that we own as a corporate body? How can we map that, and how can we use that to the best endeavours? So for the town centres in this type of space, it's what innovative solutions can we come up with and can we facilitate to help that last last meter delivery or manage that town centre space in a more effective way. We're lucky in Hounslow, we do have a lot of kind of ownership in those high streets, so we can start these pilots and start putting some really interesting things in place that could put some of these ideas into action. Then more broadly, what are we doing in our neighbourhoods? How can we, we don't have control over all consumers in the council. We kind of, some people think we do, but we don't. How can we put provisions in place to kind of take away that need for people to have those deliveries to individual houses all the time? So I know some of the recommendations are things like these delivery hubs. Can we use our leverage through planning applications, through Section 106s, through our space that we own as an authority to set up these hubs and offer that to work with partners to deliver those? Thirdly, and I think really maybe the most interesting point for me that came out of this is that how we manage construction. We know that construction work across the board causes significant challenges to our highway network. Even us out in Hounslow, let alone people in closer into the city where roads and congestion becomes even more kind of pinpointed. So we've got what we're doing in Hounslow is mapping all of our available sites, and on that, where pre-apps and applications come forward, mapping them and tracking them, so that when we get, as lots of authorities do, they put conditions to request details of construction management plans to be submitted and approved by the authorities. If we map those, we can work together where we have these sites, particularly in our growth and opportunity areas, to try and get some of those joint wins from joint site deliveries working together to kind of minimize the journeys to and from sites. So I think overall, lots of really interesting points out of here that we can really take forward. And I see, as you've said, Rob, that the council is a very key part in delivering some of this, but also being the lever through predominantly the planning system to bring the partners together to deliver some of the outputs.
Thanks, Sarah. Really, really interesting to hear, and I'll come back on some of those points. I just wanted to flag that we still haven't had Robin from Prologis join us. He may be able to still join at some point. One of the key insights that we picked up, one of many through this process, and this one came from Robin directly. Prologis are a huge provider of spaces for logistics across the world. I think the biggest in the world. And one of the things he said about London that was special was its scale. It means that you cannot sort of make the play which many smaller cities are doing, which is you sort of put all of the difficult stuff on the edges and then you bring things in with smaller, greener fleets. London has a sort of, if you like, a kind of zone 2 problem, which is that if you force everything to the edge, it's just going to be too inefficient to do it. So you have to have almost these staging posts, some of which you alluded to, Sarah, which I thought was very interesting. It's always good in our research to pick out what's the sort of particularities of the London challenge on this, because clearly lots of cities are facing these kind of issues. I'm going to open up sort of general questions now, and I'll take sort of chair's prerogative before I go to some of the many that are coming in from the people that are watching. Please do carry on putting stuff in. I'm loving that there's a busy chat. If you can put your questions directly into the Q&A, that would be even better. I'll come to one of those very shortly. But first, I just want to ask all three of you really about the effect of the pandemic and the sort of subsequent, what do we call it, supply chain crisis. We're not allowed to use the word Brexit, maybe. And what have those two things together done for this topic? That's a broad question, but it'd be interesting to get your take. Maybe Natasha, I'll come to you first.
So I think I'm not going to 100% answer that, Robert. I'm going to answer it slightly differently, so apologies to bear with me. But I think the supply chain issue touches on another point, which is one of the reasons why we've had low uptake of electric vehicles is because the OEMs have been slow in the supply of suitable electric light commercial vans that can do the duty cycles that are required. And it's been exacerbated by the fact that we have a semiconductor issue across the globe. It's not necessarily the B word. And it's been exacerbated by the fact that we have had COVID and factories have shut down and production has slowed down. So I think there's a comment in the chat around the fact that we're trying to push new technologies and EVs. Actually, I would say that EVs and technology is also here already. We did a piece of work with a home delivery company that was doing on some of their refrigerated vans 180 miles for one give and go. And they were able to do that distance in that duty cycle. So the technology is definitely here. The problem is it's not here in the volume that's needed. And I think when that is there, when the manufacturers are able to unlock those supply chains and produce these vehicles at scale, I think that we will definitely be in a position to start to adopt that technology because it is here. I do agree with that point that was made, though, that a lot of the cargo bikes, a lot of the consolidation, a lot of the freight hubs, these are ideas that are very implementable today. And it's great to hear Sarah to talk about that as well, because we are going to need local government support for the land that's needed in order to be able to put those innovations in place. So I think there's a lot to be done, and I almost wouldn't be distracted by the B word. And I think we just need to focus on the here and the now and get moving.
Thanks, Natasha. Kate, so pandemic, supply chain crisis, has that held us back or has that pushed us forward in greening freight and logistics in London?
Well, I can definitely speak to the pandemic side of it. I think from a kind of public attitudes perspective, a lot of our research has suggested that having that almost that taste of what a quieter, cleaner London could be like during that first lockdown whet a lot of people's appetite for cleaner air in our cities. And I think it also pushed not just members of the public, but businesses to think differently and to try things that they wouldn't have otherwise tried. So we are supporting a project which Team London Bridge are delivering, so the business improvement district that operates around London Bridge area. And they are offering subsidies to businesses to try cargo bikes for their deliveries and encouraging local businesses to switch to cargo bikes. And the scale at which people are interested in that and taking that up, I just don't think we saw before the pandemic. And I think that move towards some of those last mile, low emissions ways of getting goods around has been accelerated because people are willing to give something a try that they weren't before the pandemic. So I'm really excited about some of those really kind of green options that we see at a very local level. And speaking to Natasha's point, they're happening now. They can happen now. There isn't a big technological or supply chain barrier. We just need better cooperation across local government and regional government and some of our local business improvement districts.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. Sarah, I think you touched on this already when you opened, but do things feel like they've changed as a result of what we've gone through for you? Have they in a way been enabling or have they held us back?
Well, Hounslow's is interestingly placed adjacent to Heathrow. So the pandemic and the shutdown of the aviation sector had a direct impact on our communities, and we had to very, very quickly come up with a support plan that had the absolute benefit of having the opportunity for the council to become involved and say to our businesses, what is it that we can do to help you become different? How we know we need to diversify, we need to look at new ways of doing things. We've got an opportunity to do that, and through some of our funding from central government, we did some direct business support around how you can green some of our most logistic based businesses to kind of diversify away from that aviation sector in the now, and that has been really beneficial. We've seen people come up with really innovative ways of doing things and kind of look at new offers on the market. So I think there has been absolute opportunities as a result of COVID. And Hounslow, like many councils, have made the commitment to kind of such a horrendously used phrase, but to build back better, so that we do have a green focus in its wider sense to our kind of recovery plans, and that solves through everything. So when we are looking at how we support businesses, it is in that aim of, can we make things greener, can we make things better? When we're looking at our high streets, we're looking at, as I've said, those hubs and how we can look at maybe pilots of how we can do that kind of management and coordination of movement across our borough a bit better and a bit greener. And I think that is where the opportunity is. The supply chain issue is real currently, and I do agree with my colleagues on the panel that we have to kind of look beyond that and say, once we've got through this, there will be some, that won't be an issue anymore. We're feeling that currently, but it isn't something that we're concerned about long term. And I think those plans to rebuild in a greener way and with a greener focus across the piece is really the opportunity that has been realised from the pandemic shutdowns.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I'm going to go straight into our questions now from our audience. Thank you. Keep them coming. Keep voting. I'm going to go from the top downwards, more or less. I'm also going to invite Neil, if you're still with us, Neil, to join, given that Robin from Prologis has sadly not been able to join us so far. He may pop up. Who knows what can happen in Zoom land. Thanks, Neil. Just because some of these I've noticed, and unsurprisingly, can get a little technical. It might be good to just have as many experts as we can around the table, as it were. I'm going to start with David Kaner's question. So his question is, when making major planning applications, a delivery and servicing plan estimates how many deliveries will be required, and developers have to show how they'll be accommodated. Relates to your point, Sarah, I think, about construction. Would it make sense to develop DSPs, as they're known, for existing streets areas which show how the deliveries will be managed and how much curbside space is needed at which time? So decisions about curbside use and reassignment are data-based. Neil, this is going to go to your expert area as well. But would any of you like to, I'm not going to come to all of you, but would anyone like to respond to that? Does that sound like a good idea?
I can respond directly to planning. Yeah, absolutely. I think and again, the report talks about this, our streets aren't made, they've been created in times where we don't have the logistics that we have now. So looking at those streetscapes and particularly the pavement widths is such an important thing to consider. We are permitted, if you like, in planning to look at that as part of the red line of the application, but looking at that more widely and encouraging our colleagues in the transportation sector to do the same, I think that's a fab idea. I think that's great.
And I think what we're trying to do, Rob, is to look at the curb space in a different way. So rather than being a two-dimensional piece of real estate, it becomes a three-dimensional, flexible, dynamic asset. So it can be repurposed as a permit bay for loading at one part of the day, service and delivery and maintenance for other parts of the day. So that piece of curb can be flexible, can be dynamic. The legislation does allow it to happen, and we can start delivering these type of solutions now, not waiting for future policy and 3 to 5 years worth of consultation, discussion, and debate. So it's there, the tools are there, and there is a desire with the authorities to do this and the operators, from the likes of Central London Freight Quality Partnership members as well, who are looking into this. It's there. It's a handshake between the curb owners and the curb users, and all of the users operate in a different way. Parcel delivery is not the same as a brewery logistics delivery to a pub. It's about understanding the nuanced behaviours at the curbside that we need to be able to do to address this properly.
Thanks, Neil.
I think there are some very early quick wins that can be had from this, and we're looking forward to progressing some of the rollouts that we've got lined up.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go to a question from Will Bradley, who is actually ex-Central London, I do believe, or certainly Demos way back in the day. Will says, what do the panel think, and this links to our previous point, about having more loading or delivery bays on residential streets? They're set up for parking, yet many households don't have a car, but get deliveries. Like, do we really need to rethink how we use this valuable space in front of our houses to accommodate how we live today? Anyone want to take that?
I'll start off with a perspective.
Natasha.
Oh, sorry, Neil.
That's okay.
No, I'll just start off on a perspective, which is, yes, I think we do need to think about what the most efficient use of the curbside is. And I agree with Neil's point, it can be dynamic. It doesn't have to be a static piece of road. At the same time, however, I think, repurposing our parking spaces for delivery and loading bays is a great idea, but doing that without bringing the the end user on the journey is going to just cause a lot of friction. So if we're going to take away parking spaces, we have to enable those residents to be able to access public transport, multimodal transport, and the ability to carry out active travel in a clean and efficient way. Then absolutely let's repurpose it for what's most required, i.e. loading base. But I think unless we bring the end user on that journey, we're going to lose them somewhere along the way.
Thanks, Natasha. I'm going to go straight on to a noise question from David Kano again. Retiming deliveries, the concern for residents impact of noise, one of the reasons why we have the restrictions we do in London at the moment. Electric vehicles are quiet, but delivery processes are noisy. He asked, is it possible to have quiet deliveries, but when a delivery isn't quiet, it is very disturbing, and there are no powers to penalise? Like, how do we solve this kind of noise problem, but with the technology change which is happening?
If I can just leap into this one, Rob.
Okay.
What was interesting was when we looked at this, when we looked at some of the nighttime deliveries by some of the depots south of London, they said they could reduce their fleet by 65 vehicles out of a 120 vehicle fleet if they were able to deliver 24/7. One of the issues was not the trucks, it wasn't the tail lifts, it was actually the 64 decibel frequency of the clanking of the cages that tended to wake people up. So the solution design is repurpose and redesign the cages to make them quieter, and then we start to introduce quieter nighttime deliveries, which will have a major impact on the number of vehicles that need to come into central London.
Kate, I see you nodding. What do you think? I mean, we saw one of the examples in our research, what they did around McDonald's in Stockholm. Do you sort of back our recommendation that we should experiment a bit more with quieter nighttime deliveries?
I think it's definitely something that needs to be explored. And as Neil suggested, looking at what is actually causing the noise at nighttime, it would be great if we could take more deliveries off our roads during peak kind of commute times for children going to school, for children coming back to school. We know that children walk along busy main roads. So if you can remove some of those deliveries from those times, that would be fantastic. We do need to consider that noise pollution also impacts on people's health. So there's emerging evidence around impact on sleep cycles and the impact that has on even things like childhood obesity. So I think we need to consider the noise aspect as well as the air pollution aspect of this, but definitely something to be explored more. And I think
Thanks,
Robin has joined.
I'm delighted to see that Robin has popped up. Hello, Robin.
Hi, Rob. Can you hear me?
I can. That's fine. You're looking good, and we can hear you fine. I'm going to give you one moment to just, settle in and fire one more question at the panel, and then I'm going to give the floor to you. And we'd love to hear more about your role, what Prologis are up to in this space, and what your general perspective is. So the question I'm going to turn to is from Nikita Sinclair, and I think it's directed at Sarah. You've spoken, Sarah, about the opportunities within local government, but what do you see are the challenges or barriers to action on freight in local government? And maybe the sort of flip side of that is, what would you do if you could change stuff? If you had a magic wand in local government to get to grips with some of these big challenges.
Well, I can start there. If I had a magic wand, I'd let us own everything so that we could plan a magic world where everything is very orderly and that we could put things where we want it. But the excitement of the sector means that's not possible. I think the real challenge, I think there's a couple of points that just came up across the group. Things like taking loading bays and changing their purposes, things like nighttime deliveries. There's a real kind of passion in the community that is very passionate about these topics because they are directly relevant to their lives, how they use their streets and how they sleep at night. So I think there's a big kind of PR move about which I think is this paper starts to do, is that if you have a bit more of a flexible approach to thinking about things like deliveries, you could have a dramatic impact and benefit on things like air pollution going forward. So it isn't just that narrative of you want deliveries at night, that's just because you want you to be quicker in your deliveries. It's about the rounded circular conversation, which this report really does kind of sing to. So I think getting that message out across local authorities more generally, because I mean, not to drone on about the challenges and technicalities of the local authority, is we've got to get our highways authority to agree to this. We've got to get our members to agree to swapping parking for servicing bays. These are all kind of passionate topics that people effectively can vote against when they go to the polls. So it's a real kind of narrative piece about how we can switch behaviours and understanding in the things that we can control, I think, in my summary.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm going to reintroduce Robin now that we have been. I'm really sorry for the technical problems that you've clearly been struggling with. So Robin Woodbridge is UK Head of Capital Deployment and Leasing at Prologis. I will let him explain more what Prologis are all about. Robin has really been one of the driving forces of us bringing together this really excellent sort of coalition of the interested on this topic. I hope everyone agrees that we've managed to get lots of different perspectives, and there's far more represented in the research as well. Robin, it's been great to have you on this journey. Sorry that this last step was a bit bumpy, but I want to give you the floor. If you could just tell us a bit more about your role, what Prologis are up to in this space, and your general perspective on the issues we've been looking at and raised. Thanks, Rob. Look, apologies. I've been on a virtual world watching most of this since about 11:10 when we were meant to be on, and for some reason we couldn't get onto the panel. So no worries, we're here now. So look, Prologis we build, own long-term industrial logistics buildings around the world. We have about 1 billion square feet. About 2.5% of global GDP goes through our buildings, and actually about 2.5% of UK GDP goes through our buildings in the UK. So look, we're really interested in this area. I'm really pleased to have helped this report. I think it's really interesting. I think, as you say, Rob, it's great cross-sector and cross-party sort of, maybe not cross-party, but cross-interest involvement, which I think's come out with an excellent report. Neil touched on it right at the top of the call around, you know, one of the bits here that we're seeing is this growth in online. You know, we were at about 20%. Pre-COVID, it peaked at 37%. We dropped back to about 26%. I think it will go up 2 or 3% at Christmas. It always does. We have seen a shift now for people to want. I saw a presentation about a week ago in the States, and somebody used a phrase. I'm not sure I completely agree with it, but it stuck with me. People have got now accept they have a God-given right to expect something to be delivered same day or certainly next day, which I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but that's where we find ourselves. So look, London does some things that no other city in the UK does. As you said, and we looked at it, places like New York, Tokyo, Paris exhibit similar sort of performance issues around. It's so big and so congested. You can't service London from the edge of London. You have to be in amongst it. And we've worked with MIT actually on some research which sort of talks about how important it is that you actually have facilities dotted around London. I know the other piece of work that was mentioned earlier when Nikita talks to that, and we completely agree with it. And I suppose for me, you know, whilst we have consistently said to the GLA and said, look, we need to ensure that there's enough logistics space, industrial space in London, there's 3 recommendations that really stand out for me within the report. I think firstly, the point about 90% of Londoners being within 250 metres of a drop-off point by 2025, I think that's massive. If people aren't aware, the most expensive and the most difficult bit for deliveries is the final bit to your front door. And that's actually the most expensive part of the way. At the moment, it's being subsidised basically by all the delivery companies, and subsidised both financially and also from a sustainability point of view. If we were able to drop off at the bottom of buildings, you know, new apartment blocks, if they all had a drop-off point, you knew that your parcel or whatever it was in a secure location, you knew it was going to be cheaper and you knew it was more sustainable and created less congestion, that could be a massive change. And if that's something that Sarah and other planning authorities could try and sort of encourage or potentially force residential developers to do, we would be happy to work with them to try. And fun enough, I've got a call with one only in a couple of weeks to help them look at how that might actually be delivered. The second point is around, you know, any understanding about micro hubs, how they could service and deliver more positive impacts. I think that's really a similar point that's very important. And look, as a final one, this acceleration towards EV, you know, we are seeing a number of our customers making that step change. That will, interestingly, I think, probably increase, ironically, the number of smaller vehicles, because at the moment there isn't really a large vehicle EV solution. But I think that is absolutely the right way to go. It's far more sustainable. And I think anything where we need to make sure the power's there, the facilities are there,
And actually, because those vehicles tend to do less distance, we need more facilities. Again, it comes back to that same point. So look, I think it's a great bit of research. I think it comes out with a whole number of really positive recommendations. And, we've been delighted to be working with everyone and help this come forward. So, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thanks very much for that. We've got a couple more minutes for questions. I'm going to try and cram in as much as we can in the time allocated. So first, I'm going to go to Kate Fenton, who asks, and this goes directly to your point, I think, Robin, and other things we've touched on. Who do you think, panelists, the costs should be borne by for covering these more, as you've said, Robin, more expensive last miles and the logistics centres that we're sort of, broadly advocating towards? Should it be consumers, local authorities, logistics companies? No, someone's got to bear the cost. How do we work that out, and what's the right solution? Anyone like to take that up?
I have a view. It might be
Natasha, I was going to come to you.
It might be a slightly unpopular one, but there's a logic to it. I think it needs to be the consumer, and it goes back to Robin's point, which is the consumer believing that they have a right to convenience. I think consumers are very savvy when it comes to their own commercial decisions. And I think if we put the cost on the consumer, they will make the decisions of, actually, I can wait 2 days before I get this, or I can walk 500 meters and go and get it myself. And that's the reason why I say the consumer. We have to make the consumer understand the cost of their convenience, both carbon and otherwise. And then they will make the right choice. Because I don't think that just solving this with mode change or volume change is the right answer. I think consumer change has to come with the industry change and the other aspects that we've been discussing today. So I would say the consumer.
Thanks, Natasha. Anyone want to argue against that or have a different view? Go on, Neil.
Yeah, well, a different view, a quite radical view, is that the way we've built the solution is that the operational efficiencies that the operators derive are quite substantial savings, 20% efficiencies. The local authority monetises the curb space with operators who are willing to pay for access. The environmental benefits, reduced congestion, reduced emissions from fewer circling vehicles. It's a win-win for everybody, the way we've tried to design the system. And we have a great opportunity for London to be showcasing this to cities around the world.
Okay, Neil, jump in. Sorry, Robin.
That's all right. Look, I agree with Natasha, but what I would say is I think there's real scope for more efficiency. So picking up on Neil's point, through all manner of the ways in which the logistics industry works, to make sure that we haven't got any vehicles rolling empty, to make sure that we're using the optimum time on the network to move goods around, that will in itself drive efficiency, both from a sustainability point of view, reduce congestion, reduce pollution, but actually reduce cost. But ultimately, and I think it will anyway, it should be borne by the consumer. And I think we need the consumer to see, because some things we don't need today, and some things actually, if we can wait, and by waiting, you start to aggregate a load and you start to make a vehicle go far more efficiently. So it literally is going back to the old, the postman delivering to every door as you go down the street. And there's definitely efficiency in that as well.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Robin. Kate.
I don't disagree with Natasha that the consumer has to have a role, but I think people default to the easiest option, the most convenient option put before them. And so it's also a responsibility of businesses to put options in front of people, to make the default option the one that's healthiest for the environment, healthiest for our cities. It's not just on consumers to choose and make that choice for themselves. They need that option to be easiest for them.
Good point, Kate. Kate, I want to come to you as well directly with a question from Celine Shaw about, and I have to say this is not a sort of framing I've stumbled over particularly, and that's my bad really, but and that is thinking about the actual drivers themselves and the health impacts for them of the mode choice and all of the other variables in this sort of system. Is that something you've thought of much? Do we, any thoughts about that in itself? Okay.
Yeah, so we're actually doing some work on this as part of our kind of wider look at cargo bikes. So we're just about to kick off some research with the University of Westminster, which is looking at the health and well-being of e-cargo bike drivers as the kind of an emerging profession. So how can you support their health, both in terms of pollution that they might be exposed to, but also in terms of how can we make sure that patterns around insecure work aren't repeated in what is a fairly kind of new industry, and how can we take a fresh look at what good work looks like for eco-cargo bike drivers. So more to come from us on this in the future.
Great. Robin.
Yes, I think all too often the drivers are forgotten about. I think we're seeing that across the board at the moment with all the issues. You know, we've been campaigning for much better facilities for drivers. I was talking to an owner of a medium-sized haulier a year or so ago, and he was just saying, we won't service central London with HGVs now. The stress it puts on my drivers, the fact they might have an accident or something, you know, I think that's often forgot about. And we see HGV and lorry drivers as a sort of a homogeneous mass. There are people, they're driving the vehicles. We need them, you know, and we're almost bemoaning them because they might affect our Christmas. Just think about what people are saying when they say that. So I do think, you know, there are new vehicles coming out onto the market. You know, the Volta truck, for instance, you know, it's deliberately designed in a way that the driver is lower down, got much better visibility. It's obviously an electric vehicle, and there are other vehicles coming out like that. And I think both the welfare that people like us and our customers provide, the way we as society should view drivers and not see them as some problem. They're doing they only do it because we order stuff and we as society want it. And I think we've just got to wake up to that a little bit.
Very good point. One of the unforeseen consequences of this work is I ended up, and probably the supply crisis too, you know, we've all paid a bit more attention to the fate of lorry drivers and their perspective. I was following someone on Twitter who went under the name @thelorryist, and it was really insightful. He communicated incredibly powerfully what it was like to be a HGV driver in Britain today. You know, the goods and bads. I'm going to take chair. Sorry, you've already noticed I've taken chair's prerogative already to stretch us 5 minutes, just to give Robin a bit more time with us. That really gives us 1 more minute, and I'm going to ask you all just one final question, really, and that's a sort of, you know, superpowers question. If you were made the czar for freight and deliveries in London, and you sort of had unlimited power, what would you do on day one? Kate.
Oh, that's a very good question. I think for me, there's something that's come up through this conversation time and time again is how residents view some of, whether it's consolidation hubs or nighttime delivery. So I think starting a conversation about with residents, and that might be at a local authority level, it might be at a city level, about how we need to change freight and deliveries, and start a conversation which really looks at the pros and cons of these different options, and some of the kind of trade-offs that we might need to make to decide how we want our goods to get around cities going forward. So I think definitely beginning a really proper conversation with residents about this.
Great. Thanks, Kate. Who am I going to pick on next? Sarah, you sort of partly answered this question earlier, I think, but I'm going to go to you again. You can keep it brief, please.
Yeah, I think that spatial thing, having a bit more control over the kind of spatial location of hubs and the like would be the beneficial thing. But completely agree with Kate. The kind of narrative that's around the decisions that we've got to make improvements needs to start now. And I think some of the recommendations of this report have, you know, give us the tools to be able to do that. But yeah, the kind of bringing people along with us will hit wins in local authority worlds.
Great. Natasha.
Completely support those 2 points from Kate and Sarah. I think they're absolutely spot on. I guess I'll go a slightly different route, which is I would start to look at the way that we utilize current land differently. The way forecourts are being used, they could be absolutely pick up drop-off points. There's massive bits of innovation that can be done, even just dynamic curbside. So a lot of basically the suggestions that you put in the report, I think a lot of it is about innovative land use. And I think that's where I would start, because I think there's a lot that can be done with that already.
Great. I'm conscious of the clock ticking out now. Neil and Robin, if you've got a couple of 1 word, 2 word answer to what would you do on day one as the freights are, hit us with it.
I think I'd take one of the Centre for London's key recommendations, which is the introduction of dynamic curbside management. It can be done now.
Robin,
I would campaign that the sector needs to be taken seriously. Without it, society can't function. And for instance, the planning white paper, not even mentioning logistics in 84 pages, just shows at the moment the concern that the sector isn't taken seriously. And we need society, politicians, and everyone to take it seriously.
Thank you, Robin. That's a very good note to end on. I'm going to call proceedings to a close. Hopefully the work that we've done and will continue to do in this area with partners pushes us a bit on that journey. I've really enjoyed this work, this discussion. It's a really important topic, as you've all so eloquently illustrated. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed it too. I'm really sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions. Please do carry on the debate online, hashtag London Freight on Twitter, download the report, read it, share it widely. Let's get everyone talking about freight and deliveries. I'm going to say thank you to all our participants today, to Nikita, Neil, Kate, Natasha, Robin and Sarah. Thank you. Thanks to the team that you don't see as well, the hardworking Centre for London team that make these things happen. They've been brilliant. And finally, I just want to say thanks once again to our sponsors and funders, without whom we definitely would have got, we wouldn't even got off the blocks on this topic. So thank you so much to Prologis again, Grid Smarter Cities, the Borough, London Borough of Southwark, and Impact on Urban Health. If you're interested in connecting with us on any of these topics or anything else, please do take a look online at our work. We've got lots going on and lots of recent publications in this and other areas. Looking forward to carrying on the conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.